They say the Great Pyramid has rooms even the archaeologists deny exist, not because they don't know about them, but because they fear what happens inside. One of those places is the chamber beneath the king's chamber, not on any official maps, never mentioned by the Ministry of Antiquities. Locals, in hushed tones, call it the room that breathes. I met an old man in a cafe not far from the plateau. He used to be a foreman for the restoration crews. His hands trembled as he told me this story, a story that cost him his career and his peace of mind. It was during a routine structural analysis years ago. His team was using ground-penetrating radar in the king's chamber, checking for stress fractures in the granite. The equipment started glitching, displaying an anomaly directly beneath their feet. A void, a space that shouldn't be there. His supervisor dismissed it as a software error, a ghost in the machine. But the foreman, he knew the pyramid. He knew its secrets had secrets. That night, a sandstorm of biblical proportions descended on Giza, the kind that scours paint from cars and makes the sky turn a bruised orange. The pyramids were closed to the public. Under the cover of the screaming wind, the foreman took his most trusted worker, a young man named Ali, back into the Great Pyramid. He told me he was driven by something he couldn't explain, a pull. They returned to the king's chamber. The air was thick, heavy, and strangely warm. Using the radar data, they located the spot on the floor. It looked like any other massive granite block, sealed for millennia. But when they tapped it with a hammer, it didn't ring solid. It returned a deep, hollow thud. It took them 2 hours with levers and sheer will to shift the slab just enough to create a gap. A blast of air rushed out, not cold and musty like a tomb, but warm and humid, carrying a faint coppery smell like old blood and dry spices. It felt organic, alive, as if something colossal had just exhaled after holding its breath for 4,000 years. They peered into the darkness. A narrow, steep staircase, carved directly from the stone, spiraled down into a blackness so absolute their flashlights seemed to be swallowed by it. Ali hesitated. He was a devout man, and he whispered that they were treading on forbidden ground, disturbing a peace that was not meant for them. But the foreman was resolute. He had to know. He went down first. The steps were slick with a strange, thin layer of condensation, even though the air rushing up was warm. The silence was the most terrifying part. A deep, profound quiet that felt heavier than the millions of tons of stone above them. The only sound was their own ragged breathing and the scuff of their boots. Halfway down the shaft, Ali, who was following behind, suddenly grabbed his arm. "Stop, listen," he whispered, his voice trembling. The foreman froze, straining his ears against the oppressive silence, and then he heard it. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a footstep. It was a sound from the very bottom of the shaft, a slow, rhythmic, wet sound. A long, guttural inhale, followed by a rattling, prolonged exhale. It was the sound of lungs struggling for air, ancient and diseased. A primal fear pierced the foreman's bravado. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to run, but the sound was also hypnotic. It drew them downward, step by agonizing step, as they descended further. The smell intensified. It was no longer just copper and spice. It was the smell of decay. The sweet, cloying odor of a body that had been rotting not for centuries, but for days. When their boots finally touched the floor of the chamber, the breathing stopped. The sudden silence was more jarring than the sound itself. They were in a small, square room, no larger than a modern bedroom. The walls were bare, unadorned stone, glistening with the same strange moisture as the stairs. The foreman swept his flashlight beam across the room. It landed on something against the far wall. It was a figure, wrapped tightly in linen bandages, dark and stained with age. But it wasn't lying in a sarcophagus. It wasn't laid out in repose. It was propped upright against the wall, its head tilted slightly as if listening. It was facing the staircase, facing them. Its legs were bent, its arms were bound to its sides, but its head was free, and its mouth was open, not in a scream of agony or a silent gasp of death. It was open slightly, the dry, blackened lips parted. It looked like someone who had just finished saying a single word, a word like, "finally." Ollie let out a choked cry and stumbled backward, his flashlight beam dancing wildly around the room. In that frantic light, the foreman saw something else. On the floor, arranged in a semicircle around the seated figure, were canopic jars. But they weren't the traditional four. There were dozens, maybe 100, small, sealed clay pots, each one emanating the same faint, organic warmth, and they were vibrating. All of them, a low, synchronized hum that resonated through the soles of their boots. The foreman grabbed Ollie. "We have to go. Now." He didn't need to say it twice. They turned and scrambled for the stairs, their hearts hammering against their ribs. But as their feet hit the first step, a new sound echoed from the chamber behind them. It was the distinct sound of something heavy scraping against stone, a dry, dragging noise. It was followed by the wet, sickening crack of ancient joints popping, of sinew stretching after an eternity of stillness. Then they heard footsteps. Not fast, not violent, just a slow, shuffling, exhausted tread. The sound of something unaccustomed to walking, learning how to move again. It was following them up the stairs. Ollie screamed, a raw animal sound of pure terror. He pushed past the foreman and bounded up the steps, his panic giving him impossible speed. The foreman was right behind him, not daring to look back. The shuffling sound getting closer, closer, accompanied now by that same ragged, wet breathing. They burst out into the king's chamber, gasping for air, their lungs burning. They didn't stop. They slammed the massive granite slab back into place, the stone groaning in protest. In their terror, they worked with the strength of 10 men, sealing the void. For a long moment, they lay on the floor, listening. The pyramid was silent again. The wind still howled outside, but inside, the terrifying sounds from below were gone, as if they had never been. The foreman fired Ali the next day. He paid him handsomely and made him swear on his life, on the lives of his children, that he would never speak of what they saw. The boy took the money and left the city. The foreman never saw him again. The foreman stayed silent. He tried to forget. He filed a report about the radar glitch, blaming it on the sandstorm's magnetic interference. His supervisor accepted it without question. Life was supposed to go back to normal. But here's the part of the story that haunts me. The part that proves it's true. The next morning, the foreman went back to the king's chamber alone, needing to see it in the light of day. The slab they had moved, it was perfectly sealed, but the edges were filled with fresh, expertly applied mortar, still slightly damp to the touch. Neither he nor Ali had used any mortar. And when he approached his supervisor later that day, intending to confess everything, the man cut him off before he could speak. The supervisor's face was pale, his eyes wide with a fear the foreman recognized from his own reflection. He leaned in close and whispered, his voice shaking. "Last night," the supervisor said, "the night guards on the plateau reported a figure, a tall man, wrapped in what looked like rags, walking away from the Great Pyramid. They said he was shuffling, like he was exhausted. He walked out into the desert, toward the sunrise, and never looked back." The foreman asked his supervisor what they should do, who they should tell. The supervisor just shook his head slowly. "We tell no one," he said. "Some doors are not meant to be opened, and some tombs are not tombs. They are prisons." The foreman quit his job that week. He told me he still has nightmares. He dreams of the shuffling footsteps. He dreams of the 100 vibrating jars. And he dreams of that open mouth in the darkness and the silent word that hung in the air. He believes they didn't just discover a hidden chamber. They let something out. And when he finished his story, he looked at me, his old eyes filled with a terrifying certainty. He leaned across the table and whispered the last thing he ever said to me. "It was not breathing," he said. "It was waiting too." In the shifting sands of Dahshur, there is a pyramid that breathes, not with air, but with dread. It has no golden capstone, no grand causeway, no name whispered in reverence. Locals call it the Sunken Tomb, a structure so shunned that the desert winds seem to split and flow around it, as if afraid to touch its stones. An old excavator, a man with skin like cracked leather, told me his story. He worked the Dahshur site for 40 years, saw everything except this. He said the pyramid didn't just stand on the sand, it sank into it, inch by inch, year by year, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow it whole. One evening, a sandstorm rolled in, fierce, unnatural. The sky turned the color of rust. Everyone fled, but he was caught, forced to take shelter in a small supply tent near the pyramid's base. The storm howled, but through the roar of the wind, he heard something else, a low, resonant hum coming from the pyramid. It wasn't a sound that traveled through the air. He felt it in his bones, a vibration that made his teeth ache and his heart flutter out of rhythm. Curiosity, a dangerous thing in the desert, took hold. He crawled out of the tent, the sand blasting his face like tiny needles. The pyramid was a silhouette against the blood-red sky, and the hum was stronger now, louder, calling to him. He found a narrow opening near the base, a fissure not made by man or time. It looked like the stone had been torn open from the inside. The hum was a physical force, pulling him in. He squeezed through the crack. Inside, the storm vanished. Silence, absolute and deafening. The air was cold, stale, like a lung that hadn't drawn breath in millennia. And the pressure, it felt like being at the bottom of the ocean. A weight on his chest, his skull, his very soul. He switched on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but the light was wrong. It didn't reflect. It didn't scatter. The black stone walls seemed to drink it, leaving only a weak, dying circle at his feet. He walked deeper. The passage sloped downward, floor was not stone, but a thick layer of fine, black dust. With every step, his boots sank, making no sound. He felt a presence, not behind him or in front of him, but all around him. An ancient, patient awareness. Watching, waiting. Then he saw the carvings. They weren't hieroglyphs, not any symbols he recognized from a lifetime of study. They were spirals, thousands of them, etched into the walls, the floor, the ceiling, spirals within spirals, drawing his eyes in, making his head spin. The hum returned, softly at first, then growing. It was coming from the walls themselves. The stone was vibrating. The spirals seemed to pulse in the faint light. He felt his thoughts unraveling, memories slipping away. His name, his purpose, all dissolving into the humming darkness. He wanted to scream, but his throat was paralyzed. The air was too thick to breathe. The pressure was unbearable. And then, the dust on the floor began to move. Not from a draft. There was no air. It swirled at his feet, forming small, slow-motion whirlpools. The dust wasn't just dust. It was organic, like desiccated remains. He forced his body to turn, to retreat, but the passage behind him had changed. The walls had closed in. The fissure he'd entered was gone, sealed, as if the pyramid was healing its own wound. Panic, cold, and shock cut through the mental fog. He was trapped, buried alive. The humming intensified into a deafening roar. The spirals on the walls began to glow. A faint, sickly green light illuminating the chamber, and he saw it. He wasn't alone. Shapes. Humanoid, but not human. Half-formed things made of the swirling black dust rising from the floor. Their bodies were like smoke, but their eyes were points of absolute nothingness, holes in reality. A voice echoed, not through the air, but directly inside his mind. A chorus of ancient, tired whispers. You are not the stone. You are not the dust. You break the sleep. The shapes drifted closer. No malice in their non-eyes, just a profound, weary sadness. They raised their smoky arms. He felt a touch colder than ice. It didn't touch his skin. It touched his life, his years, his vitality. He felt his energy being drawn out of him, siphoned away like water from a well, feeding the stone, feeding the dust, feeding the eternal sleep. His vision blurred. The green glow of the spirals faded. The humming subsided. The last thing he saw was one of the dust figures leaning in close, its empty eyes reflecting his own terrified face, aged decades in a matter of seconds. The whisper spoke one last time. Go. He awoke outside, sprawled on the sand. The sun was high. The storm was gone. The air was clean and warm. The fissure in the pyramid wall had vanished, the stone seamless and ancient. A rescue team found him. They said he'd been missing for 3 days. The official report stated he was suffering from severe dehydration and sunstroke. Hallucinations, but the team's geologists couldn't explain one thing. The rock samples they took from the pyramid's base were standard limestone and granite. But the excavators, flashlighter knew. Military-grade model he'd unboxed the day of the storm was corroded, its metal body pitted and rusted like it had been left at the bottom of the sea for 100 years. The bent pyramid is strange. 2 angles, 2 slopes, as if someone changed their mind halfway through building it. whisper another name, a name that makes the desert wind feel colder. They call it Haram al-Baqi, the pyramid that still waits. They believe a soul is trapped inside its ancient limestone walls, literally. A man sealed alive during its construction, a ghost bound to the stone. A backpacker once told me this story. She wasn't a professional historian, just someone drawn to the silence of the desert. She waited until the tour buses rumbled away, until the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. She wanted one perfect photograph of the pyramid's strange, broken silhouette against the twilight. The official visiting hours were over. The guards were gone. It was just her and the immense, silent stones. She found a small, weathered ledge near the pyramid's lower section where the angle is steepest. She wanted to capture the texture of the blocks, the way the fading light caught in the ancient cracks. As she steadied her camera, she heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from inside the stones beside her. It wasn't the wind whistling through a gap. It wasn't a loose piece of rock settling. It was deliberate. 3 taps, a long pause, 3 taps again. The ancient call for help, so as her heart hammered against her ribs. She tried to rationalize it. An animal, an echo from a distant village. She leaned closer, placing her ear against the cool limestone. The tapping was louder now, sharper. Then she felt something else, the stone beneath her cheek. It wasn't cold, it was warm, impossibly warm, and it felt soft, like pressing against skin under a thin, rough sheet. A wave of primal fear washed over her. She pulled back, her breath catching in her throat. And then it happened. A single, pale finger pressed out from the surface of the stone, as if the limestone had turned to wet clay. A human finger, covered in a fine white dust. The nail was broken, torn. It dragged slowly downward, carving a shallow groove in the stone, a desperate, silent scratch, as if trying to claw its way out. She let out a scream that the desert swallowed whole. She scrambling over loose rocks, her camera falling from her numb hands. She didn't look back. She just ran, not stopping, until the distant lights of a small village appeared like a safe harbor. The next day, her fear was replaced by a gnawing curiosity. She had to know. She found a local elder in the village, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes holding the wisdom of the sands. She didn't show him the place, she was too terrified to go back. She just described what she saw. The old man didn't seem surprised. He didn't laugh or call her crazy. He simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant shape of the pyramid. He began to speak, his voice a low, raspy whisper. The pyramid was not built by slaves alone, he said. It was a work of masters, architects, engineers, men of great skill, and the greatest of them all served King Sneferu. His name is lost to most, but we remember. We call him Amenhotep, the shadow architect. He was Sneferu's favorite, the man who could turn the king's dreams into mountains of stone. He designed the first angle of the pyramid, the steep, ambitious slope reaching for the heavens. But the earth is not always patient. The foundation was weak. The inner chambers began to crack under the immense weight. Panic spread through the workers. They feared the structure would collapse, a tomb that would bury itself. They saw it as a bad omen, a curse from the Sneferu was furious. His perfect monument, his stairway to eternity, was failing. He blamed Amenhotep. He accused him of incompetence, of sabotage, of angering the gods with his pride. Amenhotep knew the king's rage was a death sentence. He had seen other officials disappear for lesser mistakes, so he tried to flee. He planned to escape into the desert under the cover of night, to lose himself in the vast emptiness. But the king's guards were everywhere. They were watching him. The backpacker interrupted, her voice trembling, so they executed him. The old man shook his head slowly. Worse, an execution would have been a mercy. It would have released his his soul, to the afterlife. Sneferu wanted a different kind of punishment, a punishment that would last for eternity. He gave an order to the overseers. A secret, terrible order. As Amenhotep tried to slip away from the construction site, they seized him. They didn't kill him. They dragged him back to the pyramid he had designed, to a small, unfinished chamber deep within the core. They gave him no water, no food, only his tools. Then they sealed the entrance, block by block. They built him into the wall of his own creation. His tomb became his prison. The old man paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the hot air. They say his spirit never left. Trapped between the world of the living and the dead, he is still the architect. He is still working. He spends eternity tapping on the stones, checking their integrity, searching for the flaw that cost him his life. Or perhaps he is still trying to dig his way out. The backpacker felt a cold dread, a fear far deeper than what she'd felt on the ledge. She asked the question that burned in her mind. Is the story real? The old man's eyes met hers. They were dark, ancient pools of knowledge. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked a question of his own. Did the stone feel warm? She could only nod, unable to speak. And did you hear the tapping? Again, she nodded. The old man leaned forward, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of 4,000 years. If you heard the tapping, then he is still working.